Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. If you listen to previous episode, Dr. Cruz has gone through the Monroe Doctrine and talks a little bit about foreign policy. And as much as we would like to do everything in chronological order, sometimes things come up, and we want to go now back in time to 1821 to President John Quincy Adams in his July 4th address. So Dr. Cruz is back with us. Dr. Cruz, you mentioned in our last episode on the Monroe Doctrine that this 1821 address by, I said president, but it was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams on July 4th is an important source for understanding President Monroe's dramatic statement in 1823 about the U.S. being predominant in the Americas in the Western Hemisphere. Why is the Quincy Adams address in 1821 so significant?
Thank you, Liz. Yes, the basic reality here is it's the Secretary of State of the United States in 1821 giving an address basically to Congress and others in Washington, D.C., because he's been asked to honor the 4th of July, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of American Principles, this important movement in our founding. And for us in the 21st century, we don't easily understand how important the Secretary of State was in American domestic politics as well as international affairs in the first decades of the United States and well into the 19th century, that we now think often of vice presidents being potential presidents of the United States. But it was different for our first century, at least. The stepping stone to the presidency was not the vice presidency. That only worked really once for John Adams under George Washington. And then you could say, well, maybe twice, Jefferson moving from Secretary of State to Vice President to then President. What becomes the pattern from Jefferson's presidency forward is that the Secretary of State is kind of the heir apparent as we develop a party system, as parties are thinking about who the potential presidential candidates are. The Secretary of State has some domestic roles, as our Constitution and Article 2 works out, but obviously the lead in advising the president on foreign policy and being vetted by the Senate for that. So John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State got the position, which has been for decades the kind of heir apparent position, or you're a prime candidate to be president of the United States. So he's talking about the domestic in this 1821 address about the domestic character of America and also our role in the world. So if a Secretary of State gives an address to Congress and people in Washington D.C., it's a big deal. Bigger than it would be now for us in the 21st century. And then where are we in 1821? In 1821, we are several years past the War of 1812, which is a bit of a mess. National capital is invaded and burned, but we come out of it, and we come out of it effectively as a great power. And the Monroe presidency with John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State is taking some steps to build up our great power status. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, Monroe sort of holds this view that the presidency is kind of weak. Congress should really take the lead. But there are some domestic policies being passed about national improvements and growth of the American economy. As I think I'd mentioned in earlier episodes, by 1821, the Monroe administration is effectively presiding over the birth of a naval academy. Not explicitly by name, can't get that passed through Congress yet. But there's going to be a place for professional education of naval officers, just like there is for Army officers at West Point. And that's a signal of America being a great power in the world. that we've always had a commitment from Article 1 in the Constitution to providing and maintaining a Navy. We're going to have a permanent Navy. But now this is going to be more of a great power Navy, right? And the Missouri Compromise has passed. So there's something of a domestic crisis that we've gotten over. There's some calm about that. The Union's going to hold together. And then the final thing happening in world affairs is that there are revolutionary movements in South America, Central and South America, in Europe, invoking the American Revolution and the American Declaration of 1776, invoking the French Revolution of 1789 and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The monarchies, so, the French Revolutionary Napoleonic crusade against all monarchies has failed. In one sense, Napoleon is gone, but that kind of spirit is out in the world. And Secretary of State and Quincy Adams and President Monroe are dealing with calls coming from all over the world to the United States, especially the president. Hey, we're a people that want to be liberated from this monarchy that we're under, this autocracy under. You're the United States. You should help us. And then especially if it's in our own hemisphere, right, in our neighborhood, Central and South America, shouldn't we get involved? And so Quincy Adams addressing at the closing final, quarter of the address is speaking to this issue of what is America's leading position in the world and what responsibility do we have to these revolutionary movements and establishing new republics.
So you mentioned that one particular quotation from this 1821 address is frequently cited in current debates about American foreign policy, about our role in world affairs.
Yeah. So again, this is the theme that being a citizen in the 21st century is hard, difficult business, just like it's always been for 250 years. You have some thinking and learning to do. Here's an 1821 address by a Secretary of State that's being batted around in current debates, especially in the American post-Cold War period since the early 1990s. What should America's role be in the world? So, Liz, if you would read that passage that's most frequently cited now about the debates over American foreign policy.
America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own.
So here's the Secretary of State in 1821 saying, yes, we care about liberty in the world. We care about these republics being born or revolutionary movements against monarchies or autocracies. But our job is not to be some, mythic, heroic demigod figure going out there slaying dragons. We wish well to all of these revolutionary and independence movements and republics, but we are the champion, hero, and vindicator only of our own liberty. So it's now invoked as a statement for American restraint in the world. There are terms that get batted around in American foreign policy debates, especially since the 1930s and then the outbreak of what we call the Second World War, about isolation and this charge of being isolationist. Okay? That can be loaded and pejorative. So a maybe gentler word is restraint, or America should be more inward focused and only be outward focused necessarily, as it's absolutely necessary, right? So the restraint school, let's call it. America is a great power at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, and now, 30 plus years later. We are a great power. We're still the world's largest economy. We have the world's largest military, but we should be restrained in how we think about our power in the world, and especially the use of our military power. And they invoke this quotation from the 1821 address. See, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, later President John Quincy Adams, he was wise in saying this, and we've forgotten this wise principle. Now, I'm going to read another quote that sort of fleshes this out. Right? Why is Quincy Adams saying, don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy? So shortly after this, he says, if we did this, if we were out there taking up flags and banners and causes that are not our own, but some other place, revolution happening, a republic happening, we'd get involved in all the messy wars of the world. So then he says, now the fundamental maxims of her policy, our policy, would insensibly change from liberty to force. The sort of, he's using language from myths and histories. The sort of crown we would wear on our brow would not be the beam, shining the beam of freedom and independence, but it would be an imperial diadem, as if we become like the Roman Republic turned empire. And then I'll just leave it here, we might become dictatress of the world, right? Dictator, dictatress of the world. But we would no longer be the ruler of our own spirit, her own spirit. We'd lose liberty. We'd become an imperial power. Okay? So that's the warning he's given. My own view is that his 1821 address as a whole is a little more complicated than this. And as Secretary of State, he's not really an isolationist or an insularist or even a restraintist in the way we think about it in the post-Cold War American foreign policy debates.
So if there's such an emphasis by John Quincy Adams in 1821 on the United States not being involved in the international fights to spread liberty and Republican government, why are you suggesting this address as an important resource for understanding the 1823 Monroe Doctrine with its statement of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere so as to protect liberty and Republican governments close to the United States? Aren't the two documents in tension or even contradicting one another?
Yes, it's a fair point. If the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, basically urged upon President Monroe by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, is making this astounding statement that we are a great power in the world, and we are so great a power that we say that all the other great powers stay out of this quarter of the globe, stay out of this hemisphere. How does that fit with this statement that we should not be going abroad in the world as some kind of imperial power? How could they possibly fit together? So I think if you read it's an extraordinary assignment for yourself as a citizen or for a student. This is a long address. So we're not used to this now in the 21st century world, a president or secretary of state speaking for a full hour from a prepared script, longer than an hour perhaps. It's a long, complicated address. And so it's more complicated than this one set of quotations we just looked at. And again, I think John Quincy Adams, who was appointed to the American Foreign Service by President Washington, is thinking about Washington's farewell address. How do we hold together the tension between the statement, we will soon be a great nation? What should we do with our great nation status, great power status? The tension between being a great power and our principles of justice from the Declaration of Independence. We can't be an empire. Washington says, we will soon be such a great power that we will be in command of our own fortune, our own fortunes, humanly speaking. We will be able to dictate the terms to the world of peace or war, as he says, our interests guided by justice shall recommend to us. Interests and justice in balance. That's what Quincy Adams is trying to figure out as we become an even greater power after the War of 1812 and our economy is growing and Missouri Compromise has settled things down. So if Washington, I think in the Quincy Adams interpretation in 1821 of the Washington's farewell address, Washington's warning about no permanent alliances in 1796 is given to a weaker United States as a power, right? We're not really a great power yet. Washington says no permanent alliances, but he says you can have alliances as you need them. And I don't read the farewell address as many do, as more insularist or isolationist or even restraintist. It's more complicated. Washington's advice is more complicated, what we do with our great power status. And here, to get to the nub of it, the 1821 address by John Quincy Adams portrays America as the greatest country ever in the history of the world. You can't believe the things he says in this 1821 address. He invokes the history of Moses, with God's help, liberating the Jews from Egypt and establishing a republic, basically, right? And setting Western civilization on a path of, liberty is what God intends for human beings. He invokes the Greeks and the Romans, Athens fighting for liberty and the Roman Republic being for liberty. He invokes Shakespeare and John Milton and this all puts America as like the inheritor of and the culmination of the greatest completion point of these great elements of all of human history, all of human civilization, especially Western civilization, for liberty. We are the greatest example of and power for liberty in the world and in all of human history. This is not a kind of meek, humble address. Who is America to be thinking about being a power? We should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, just protect our own liberty. This is like building up America as it's like the greatest thing ever. And then saying, but don't go too far with it. Right. And the Shakespeare he's invoking repeatedly is Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, in which the last defenders of Roman Republican liberty decide Caesar's basically an emperor tyrant already, the warlord Caesar, and they need to kill him to defend liberty. So he repeatedly invokes this idea of Republican revolution in the name of liberty, bloody and violent as it is. He repeatedly refers to fellow citizens of the United States. I think he's invoking the opening line of Washington's farewell address, friends and fellow citizens. He repeatedly refers, and especially after, so the last, few pages, if you have the text of it, of this 1820 address, after the "we go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy" warning, after it, he invokes Virgil, epic poem about the destiny of Rome and its greatness. He invokes Virgil. He's clearly saying we are the inheritor of the greatness of the Roman Republic, but we will not be as imperial as the Roman Republic. And the last lines of it invoke the parable of the Good Samaritan. America's responsibility in the world is to act the way the Good Samaritan did. Crimes happen. Thugs beat up on people. Somebody steps in to repair it. And the last lines of the address is quoting the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus says to anyone listening, "Go thou and do likewise." It's not a passive thing. It's not just stay at home and protect your own liberty. And it's for very Christian people in 1821, it's invoking the Christ figure in the scripture, "Go thou and do likewise." So this is complicated. I'm sorry. There's not an easy way to read this as saying, oh, so then he's contradicting himself. And he's saying, but it does explain, the complexity explains how could the same person as Secretary of State within 2 years be advising his President Monroe, to declare the Monroe Doctrine, to declare ourselves a great power, dominant in a quarter of the world. The rest of the world, the great powers, stay out. How does that fit with go abroad not to search for monsters? Well, the complexity is already there in the 1821 address. And I'll just say, this has been, this has been the challenge from Washington's farewell address onward. This was the challenge. What do we do when the French Revolution breaks out? What do we do with our treaty with France in Washington's first and second administrations? What do we do about Britain being panicked and fighting wars against the French Revolutionary Republic? What do we do about our westward expansion, right? We've had the potential to be a great power. We've become a great power. How do we do that, be a great power responsibly, given our principles in the Declaration of Independence? It's an ongoing argument for 230 some odd years, and it takes some work to figure it out. And I just would recommend avoid simple answers. I don't want to tell anybody what the right foreign policy doctrine is in 2026, but just avoid simple slogans and simple answers. Avoid taking just a paragraph or a sentence or something out of an important document. Do I understand the whole document? Do I understand the whole moment? Do some work. And that also means we have to be open to various interpretations of an important document like this, various arguments about what the best American foreign policy should have been in an earlier moment of our history, should be now. So it sets us up for a little bit of deeper study, sets us up for some reasonable disagreement and civil disagreement about these important historical questions, but also obviously currently important questions.
Well, and thank you for saying that too, Dr. Carice, because I think that's, one of the reasons we like going through primary sources is there is nuance. It is not something that you can just pluck a quote from and say like, well, this is good and we're moving on. There is so much context that needs to go with it. And I think one of my favorite things when I was a teacher about teaching primary sources is that there is nuance. We need to make sure we're not looking through a lens of presentism. We're understanding how these documents, influence history, but also influenced other documents. So I'm so looking forward to this kind of whole series, looking at these primary sources and talking about the nuances of them. So Dr. Carice, again, thank you so much.
Well, great. Thanks, Liz, for your work in organizing the podcast and organizing these episodes.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.